A silver face stares at you from behind museum glass. Serene, almost sleeping. The eyes are closed, the expression calm, the face of a man at rest. But the object is made of iron coated in silver, and it was not found in a tomb. It was found face down in a German bog, surrounded by the scattered bones of 20,000 men. Those men were the professional heart of the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever built. They carried standardized weapons forged in imperial workshops. They had conquered Britain, Egypt, Gaul, and Judea. They had never, in living memory, lost a war. And in 4 days in September of the year 9 of the Common Era, they were destroyed so completely that the emperor who sent them never recovered his mind from the shock. But here is what makes this story something other than a simple military disaster. The man who destroyed them had been raised in Rome. He spoke Latin. He held Roman citizenship. He had commanded Roman auxiliary forces in Roman wars. He sat at the Roman governor's dinner table the night before the march that would kill 20,000 men. And the governor called him a trusted friend. What does it take to be so certain of your own power that you cannot see its destruction walking toward you? Publius Varys was not a fool. He was warned. Twice. By name. By a man who begged to be arrested alongside the traitor just to make the warning credible. And still Varys waved the warning away. Because what was being described was something his entire life had taught him was simply not possible. You will discover that the killing ground, a corridor only 220 meters wide between a hill and a bog, had been engineered and prepared over an entire summer, while the man who built it attended Roman banquets and smiled at Roman jokes. You will learn that Arminius' own father-in-law offered to have himself arrested alongside the conspirators, and Varys dismissed the offer as a personal grudge. And you will understand why the numbers 17, 18, and 19, the destroyed legions, were permanently retired from the Roman military order of battle, and why some of the men who survived that forest were still being held as slaves in Germanic territory 40 years later, found by a Roman army that could barely believe what it was hearing. To understand how a Roman governor, intelligent and experienced, could be so completely deceived, we need to go back to Rome at the height of its certainty, and the moment that certainty became the most dangerous weapon in an enemy's hands. By the year 7 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire had reason for its confidence that went well beyond arrogance. For 3 decades, the legions of Augustus Caesar had pushed the empire's northeastern border progressively eastward, campaign by grinding campaign, until Roman soldiers had stood on the banks of the Elbe River, roughly 500 kilometers beyond the Rhine, and planted their standards in ground no Roman army had ever touched. The tribes of the region had been defeated. Their chiefs had submitted. Their sons had been taken as hostages to Rome. On the maps in Rome's administrative offices, the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe had been designated a province, Germania Magna, not a frontier, not a military zone, a province, the kind of organized, tax-paying, law-abiding Roman territory that Gaul and Spain and Syria had become. This mattered because the strategic logic behind it was sound. The Rhine to Elbe frontier would be shorter and more defensible than the Rhine line alone. It would provide access to Germanic timber, slaves, and agricultural land. Most importantly, it would buffer the Romanized provinces of Gaul from whatever lay further east. Emperors and generals had been building toward this outcome since Julius Caesar first bridged the Rhine 60 years earlier, and by the reign of Augustus, it appeared to be within reach. The architect of the final push was Augustus's stepson Tiberius, who conducted major campaigns in the years 4 and 5 of the Common Era, traversing Germanic territory with systematic professional efficiency, subduing tribe after tribe, demanding tribute and compliance. In the year 6, Tiberius declared Germania pacified. He prepared to march against the last significant independent power in the region, Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni in Bohemia, with a force of 12 legions. It was the largest Roman force ever assembled for a single operation in the north. Then everything changed. A massive rebellion erupted in the Balkan province of Illyricum, what Roman sources called the Great Illyrian Revolt, and it demanded immediate, overwhelming response. Tiberius had to abandon the Maroboduus campaign entirely. 8 of the 11 legions stationed in Germania east of the Rhine were transferred south to crush the rebellion. In place of 12 legions primed for the final conquest, Varus was left with 3. 3 legions to administer a province that stretched 300 kilometers east of the Rhine, contained dozens of independent-minded tribal communities, and had been pacified for only a handful of years. But here is what made this vulnerability invisible from Rome. The province looked peaceful. Archaeological excavations in the 21st century have uncovered a Varian-era Roman civilian settlement at Waldgirmes in what is now central Germany. A proper Roman forum, with stone buildings, markets, and a gilded bronze equestrian statue of Augustus. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian writing in the 3rd century but drawing on earlier sources, confirms that Varus had been conducting the final stages of full colonial administration. Law courts, taxation, census records, all the institutional machinery of a functioning Roman province. The Waldgirmes Forum is the physical proof that Rome genuinely believed it had won. The province wasn't being held at sword point. It was being governed. That belief, specific, material, archaeologically confirmed, was the foundation of everything that followed. Varus arrived in Germania not as a general expecting war, but as an administrator expecting routine. He would impose taxes, hold courts, manage the census, and retire the province to whoever came next. He had done exactly this before, in Africa and in Syria, Judea, and it had worked both times. There was no tactical intelligence failure at Teutoburg Forest, no single moment of negligence that could have been corrected. There was something harder to fix than that. An entire institutional framework that had decided, at the highest levels, that the hard part was over. Into this administrative certainty, Augustus sent exactly the wrong man. And somewhere in the forests east of the Rhine, exactly the right enemy was already waiting. Velleius Paterculus, the Roman historian who knew Publius Quinctilius Varus personally and served in the same theater of operations, described him as a man of, quote, 1. This is a diplomatic assessment. Cassius Dio is less generous, calling Varus, quote, 2, read together. These are portraits of a man who was chosen for the wrong job at the worst possible moment. Varus was born around 46 years before the Common Era, into an old patrician family of fading distinction. His rise through the Roman political system was powered not by battlefield achievement, but by the most reliable engine in Roman public life: proximity to Augustus. He accompanied the emperor on a 3-year tour of the eastern provinces in his 20s, and the association launched his career. He served as consul, one of Rome's 2 highest annual magistrates. In the year 13 before the Common Era, alongside the future emperor Tiberius himself. He governed the African province, governed Syria and Judea with 4 legions, and developed a reputation in the east for administrative effectiveness paired with a particular taste for high taxation and strict legal enforcement. In Judea, he suppressed a revolt with notable harshness. He was accustomed to authority, comfortable with the mechanisms of Roman governance, and utterly at home in the structured, urbanized, deeply Romanized world of the Eastern Mediterranean. This was precisely the problem. Syria and Judea were ancient civilizations with city-based economies, established hierarchies, and administrative traditions stretching back centuries. When Varus imposed Roman taxes and Roman law in those provinces, he was working with populations that understood what taxation and law were, even when they resented them. Germania was something entirely different. The tribal confederacies east of the Rhine had no cities, no centralized administration, no written legal tradition, and a warrior culture in which Roman concepts of tribute and judicial authority were not merely unfair. They were an existential insult. What had worked in Syria would not work in a birch forest. Velleius Paterculus, writing with the candor of someone who had watched this personally, noted that Varus entered the province of Germany and imagined that the inhabitants were a people who were only men in limbs and voice, and that, as they could not be subdued by the sword, they might be civilized by law. He administered them as if they were already a conquered people awaiting Roman improvement, rather than independent warriors watching for the moment to strike. He levied taxes on communities that had never paid taxes. He subjected tribal disputes to Roman courts rather than Germanic custom. He required the performance of deference that Rome expected from its subjects, from people who had not agreed to be subjects. Varus was not ignorant of what he was doing. He was doing exactly what he had been sent to do. Augustus had sent him to complete the provincial transition, and Varus was completing it. The problem was that the transition had been declared complete about 4 years too early, on the basis of military campaigns that had defeated tribal armies without dismantling tribal cultures. The legions of Tiberius had won battles. They had not won the province. And the man sent to administer the difference was a lawyer governor who had never, in his entire career, faced anything like what was coming. Paradox lived in every administrative decision Varus made in the summer of 9. The taxes he collected funded the roads that made the province look more Roman. The courts he held demonstrated the reach of Roman law. The census he conducted mapped the population and its resources. Each of these acts was an act of governance. Each was also, simultaneously, a recruitment poster for the man across the campfire who had spent years learning how to use Rome's own certainty against it. Picture Arminius at Varus's dinner table in the summer of 9. He is roughly 25 years old. He speaks Latin without an accent. He wears the dress of a Roman equestrian, a knight of the empire, a rank he has earned in imperial military service. He knows the jokes, understands the references, holds the wine correctly. Varus trusts him. Why wouldn't he? Arminius has been Roman since childhood. He was born around 17 or 18 years before the Common Era, the eldest son of Segimer, chief of the Cherusci tribe, in territory corresponding to modern central Germany near Hanover. When the Romans defeated the Cherusci under Drusus in the year 8 before the Common Era, the standard diplomatic resolution was applied. Segimer surrendered his sons as high-status hostages. Arminius and his younger brother Flavius were taken to Rome, raised in the manner of Roman aristocrats, educated in Latin language and Roman military doctrine, and eventually granted Roman citizenship and the rank of eques. Both brothers served in the Roman military. Most historians accept, though direct documentation is limited, that they served together suppressing the Great Illyrian Revolt in the years 7 through 9 of the Common Era, commanding a Cheruscan auxiliary cohort and gaining intimate knowledge of how Roman legions operated from the inside. Scholar Sean McNally, in analysis cited by multiple modern historians, argues that 2 specific events shaped Arminius's strategic thinking. An ambush of the Roman general Drusus by the Cherusci in the year 11 before the Common Era, in which the Romans escaped only with great difficulty after being caught in unfavorable terrain, and Drusus's subsequent victory over the Cherusci in 8 BCE, the battle that had made Arminius a hostage. From these events, McNally writes, Arminius drew what would become his operational thesis. Quote 4, Arminius spent the rest of his life designing exactly that situation. His brother Flavius never drew the same conclusion. The fraternal divide that opens up here is worth sitting with, because it is not a story of obvious choice. Both brothers received identical treatment in Rome. Both served the same campaigns. Both had the same knowledge of Roman strength and Roman weakness. Flavius remained loyal to Rome for decades, serving through the entire subsequent conflict, and Tacitus records him still in Roman service years after Teutoburg. The choice Arminius made was not inevitable. It was active. Whatever drove him back toward his Cheruscan identity, the sight of his countrymen taxed and subjected, the accumulated weight of childhood displacement, ambition for the kingship he would eventually seek. It was a decision made in full knowledge of what both paths looked like. That is what makes him genuinely dangerous. Not a savage reacting instinctively, but a Roman-educated aristocrat making a calculated strategic choice with full understanding of the costs. His original Germanic name has not survived in the historical record. Arminius is his Roman name. The German Reformation would later transform it into __quote_5_ and build an entire nationalist mythology around it. What the Romans called him in life was the name of a Roman knight who, Tacitus would later write, was quote 6. A verdict from a Roman historian about Rome's most devastating enemy, preserved in the historical record with the weight of genuine grudging respect. To spring the trap he had been designing for years, Arminius needed one thing he did not yet have: a reason to get 20,000 Roman soldiers off the military road. The tribes Arminius needed to unite had been enemies for generations. The Cherusci, the Marsi, the Chatti, the Bructeri, the Chauci, these were not natural allies. They competed for territory, raided each other's settlements, and maintained feuds that predated Roman contact by centuries. Uniting them into a coordinated military coalition was not a diplomatic challenge. It was something closer to a miracle of common grievance. And Varys's administrative policies provided exactly the raw material Arminius required. Every tax Varys collected was a conversation Arminius could have. Every Roman court that overrode tribal custom was an argument he could make to a chieftain who had previously considered the Cherusci his enemies and the Romans merely distant irritants. The resentment that Roman provincial administration generated was not accidental, and it was not limited to one tribe. It was structural and universal, running through every community east of the Rhine that had watched Roman administrators arrive with styluses and ledgers, and the confident assumption that everything they surveyed already belonged to the empire. Arminius was careful. He maintained his performance of Roman loyalty throughout. He attended Varys's summer camp on the Weser River. He sat at the governor's table. He provided military advice. He acted as the indispensable liaison between Roman administration and tribal leadership that his position required. And in doing so, had access to every dimension of Roman strength, disposition, and planned movement. While he sat at those dinners, the earthen wall was growing. Archaeological excavations at Calcrease, the site now accepted by the overwhelming consensus of historians and archaeologists as the location of the battle's decisive phase, have confirmed that the Germanic ambush was not improvised. The wall, a turf and packed sand rampart running at minimum 700 meters along the northern slope of Calcrease Hill, with a wooden palisade on top and gates at intervals for sally attacks, was engineered over months. The concentration of Roman military artifacts in front of the wall and their near-total absence behind it tells the tactical story without words. The wall was built before the battle, and Roman soldiers died against it without crossing it. This construction took place during the same summer that Arminius was dining with Varys. He was building the killing ground while attending the banquets of the man whose army would die there. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian of the 3rd century drawing on earlier sources, records another dimension of the operational plan that demonstrates its remarkable scope. The ambush at Calchris was not to be the only Roman disaster that morning. Arminius had prearranged for Germanic communities across the entire province to simultaneously eliminate the small Roman detachments stationed among them. Soldiers assigned to assist local administration, who had been positioned throughout the region as the visible human presence of Roman authority. They were to be killed on a coordinated signal the morning the main column marched. In a single morning, every Roman military presence in Germania east of the Rhine was to be destroyed simultaneously. This was not a tribal uprising. It was a province-wide coordinated military operation, planned and executed with a precision that reflected the auxiliary commander's training. Smithsonian Magazine's Fergus Bordewich, drawing on the archaeological and historical record, notes that the coalition Arminius assembled represented roughly 5 of the 50-plus Germanic tribes in the region. Not a universal uprising, but a sufficient one. The tribes that joined did so because the common grievance was real, and because Arminius had given them something their traditional warfare could not offer: a specific target, a prepared ground, and a man who knew exactly how the enemy thought. By late summer, the wall was built. The tribes were in position. The fake rebellion pretext was ready. All Arminius needed was the moment Varys would trust him one final time. The disaster had a specific moment where it could have been stopped. This is not hindsight speculation. It is one of the most thoroughly documented near misses in ancient military history, confirmed across multiple primary sources by writers who had access to survivors and participants. The moment was a dinner. The man who tried to stop it was Segestes, a Cheruscan nobleman and Arminius's own father-in-law, and the warning he gave was so explicit, so complete, and so credible that its rejection by Varys stands as one of the most consequential failures of judgment in the ancient record. Segestes was a pro-Roman chieftain who had maintained his alliance with the empire consistently through the years of growing tension. He had reasons both principled and personal to oppose Arminius. He believed Roman authority was the foundation of regional stability, and he despised his son-in-law specifically because Arminius had married his daughter Thusnelda against his explicit wishes, in what amounted to an elopement. That personal animosity would later give Varys grounds to dismiss the warning. But Tacitus, in his annals, records what Segestes actually said, and it was not a vague allegation motivated by domestic grievance. Segestes, according to Tacitus, urged Varys to arrest Arminius and the other chiefs, and also himself, meaning Segestes offered to be placed under arrest alongside the conspirators, removing himself from the equation entirely in order to eliminate any possibility that Varys could read the warning as self-interested manipulation. Think about what that offer means. Segestes was asking Varys to detain him, to treat him as a potential threat and remove him from action, purely to make the warning credible. He was willing to accept imprisonment to prevent a catastrophe he could see coming. This is not the behavior of a man nursing a personal grudge. This is the behavior of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen and was willing to sacrifice his own freedom to stop it. Velleius Paterculus, who knew both Varys and the events personally, records that this was not a single warning casually dismissed. Segestes had frequently before tried to caution Varys, coming to him on multiple occasions across the summer with the same essential message. The dismissals were not accidental inattention. They were a pattern. Varys refused to act, and historians have generally understood why. The psychological trap Arminius had constructed was, at its deepest level, not tactical, but social. Arminius was a Roman citizen, an equestrian, a decorated auxiliary commander. He had served loyally for years. He had the confidence of the governor, the respect of the military staff, and the cultural markers that Roman aristocratic society used to identify trustworthy men. Velleius Paterculus, using language that tells us exactly how Romans processed this betrayal afterward, described the Germans broadly, mux, as a race born to mendacity, a characterization that reveals less about the Germans than about Roman psychology. It was simply not possible, within the framework of Roman social understanding, that a man Rome had elevated to citizen and knight could lead what Romans called a barbarian uprising. The category didn't exist. You were either Roman or barbaric. Arminius had been made Roman. Therefore, Arminius could not be conspiring. Segestes' warnings, by this logic, were simply a misunderstanding generated by a domestic dispute. By morning, Arminius would ride away from the column with Varys' blessing. Off to gather reinforcements, he said. And Varys would never see him as an enemy until the arrows were already falling. Stand at Calchries today, and the landscape tells the story without a word of explanation. To the south, the Calchriser Berg rises to 157 meters. Its northern slope crossed by multiple deep brooks and rivulets that make movement laborious. To the north, the Grosses Moor, the Great Bog, stretches away in a flat, waterlogged impassability that no army could cross. Between them runs a strip of firm ground, 220 meters wide. That is the entire battlefield. 220 meters, approximately the length of 2 football pitches placed end to end. Between a hill you could not easily climb and a swamp you could not cross. With dense forest pressing close and limiting visibility to a matter of tens of meters in any direction. Roman historian Cassius Dio described the area, writing in the 3rd century, as full of, quote, 11 scholars at livius.org, have noted that this description is geographically inaccurate for Calchries. The site is notably flat, with no significant ravines, and attribute the discrepancy to ancient literary convention about barbarian territory, which was typically imagined as the edge of the civilized world and therefore portrayed with appropriately savage geography. What the actual terrain provided was not dramatic elevation, but something more operationally devastating. A natural funnel with no exits and no room to deploy. A Roman legion's tactical doctrine was built around the ability to form lines. The legionaries trained obsessively for formation fighting. The interlocking shields, the coordinated advance, the disciplined response to cavalry charges, the controlled retreat. All of it depended on sufficient space for formations to exist. In the Calchries corridor, there was no such space. A column that stretched 7 to 8 miles through the narrows could not compress itself into fighting formation at any point along its length. The front was engaged, while the rear had not yet entered the corridor. The middle had no way to know what was happening at either end. Centralized command, the Roman army's operational nervous system, became functionally impossible. Arminius had selected this ground with full knowledge of what it would do to Roman tactical doctrine. The wall he had built along the hill's northern slope, confirmed by archaeology to be at minimum 700 meters long and 1.5 meters high, with a wooden palisade reinforcing the top and gates through which Germanic warriors could sally, strike, and retreat, was positioned to exploit the corridor's natural compression. The Romans would be funneled past it with no room to flank, no elevation to assault from, and no dry ground to their north. The concentration of Roman military artifacts discovered in front of the wall's position, with almost nothing behind it, is the archaeological record's unambiguous statement about what happened when the legions reached it. Then consider the weather. Cassius Dio, drawing on earlier sources, records the conditions with specific detail that resonates across 2,000 years. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 1-2. Underscore, underscore the Roman scutum, the large curved rectangular shield that was the legionary's primary defensive tool, was made of laminated wood covered in linen and leather. Waterlogged, it became significantly heavier than its combat weight. The standardized heavy equipment that had served the legions from Britain to Egypt was becoming a burden rather than a protection. In rain that the lightly armored Germanic warriors, moving freely through familiar terrain, barely noticed. The column filed in. The wall waited, and somewhere above them, on the northern slope of the Kalkreiser Berg, tens of thousands of Germanic warriors pressed silently against their shields and waited for the signal that Arminius had been planning to give for years. The march began in what Cassius Dio records as established late summer weather that would turn catastrophically before it was over. The Roman army departed its Weser River summer camp in standard march formation, not battle order. This detail matters profoundly. Standard march formation for a Roman army of this size meant the column stretched somewhere between 7 and 8 miles, from vanguard to rearguard, with the baggage train, civilian followers, merchants, and camp servants interspersed throughout. The soldiers were in marching gear, not combat configuration. Their scuta were in carrying position, their pila slung. They were moving, not fighting. They were, by every behavioral signal available, going home for the winter. At the start of the march, Arminius approached Varys with a request. He and his co-conspirators needed to depart the column briefly, he explained, to complete the muster of allied Cheruscan warriors who would escort the legions back to the Rhine. Varys granted the request without hesitation. It was the kind of administrative coordination that a trusted auxiliary commander handled constantly. Arminius rode north, away from the column, toward his waiting warriors. Historian McNally's analysis, widely accepted in the modern literature, notes the operational consequence. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 1-3, underscore, underscore a quarter of Varys's effective force had just ridden away with the governor's blessing, taking with it the men who knew the terrain and the army's eyes on the road ahead. What happened next was not confined to a single corridor. Cassius Dio records in his Roman history that Arminius had prearranged for the Roman soldiers stationed throughout the province. Small detachments assigned to assist local communities, the human capillaries of Roman provincial administration, to be attacked simultaneously on a signal that morning. The garrisons, the guard posts, the work parties scattered across hundreds of kilometers of supposedly pacified territory all came under attack in the same hours that the main column marched. Not one or two isolated incidents that might be attributed to local unrest. A province-wide simultaneous elimination. In a single morning, the Roman administrative presence east of the Rhine effectively ceased to exist as a coherent network. The attacks on the main column began as Cassius Dio describes, with the soldiers still in marching mode, still felling trees and bridging streams and building road as they went, engineering a peaceful province while an ambush was closing around them from every direction. The Germanic warriors used the forest for cover, striking at the column's extended flanks and disappearing back into the trees before Roman formation discipline could be brought to bear. Hit and withdraw. Hit and withdraw. The tactical method was not original. It was the method Arminius had identified years earlier as the only way to defeat Rome, and it was working with brutal efficiency. By nightfall, the Roman legionaries had done what their training demanded. They built a fortified camp, the disciplined response to any tactical crisis, the physical expression of Roman military order, a ditch, a rampart, a defensive perimeter. This camp's outline still existed 6 years later, when another Roman army would find it and recognize what it represented. Tacitus describes the first camp's, quote, 14 showing, quote, 15. The archaeological evidence of professional soldiers maintaining their doctrine under pressure. But the camp could not be held indefinitely, and everyone inside it knew it. By nightfall, on the first day of the march, the Romans had taken casualties from an enemy they could barely see, lost contact with their scattered outposts across the province, and marched into ground that was growing less familiar and more hostile with every kilometer. The man who knew this terrain, the man who had guided them here, was gone. By nightfall, the Romans had made camp. But everything they had built east of the Rhine, every fort, every outpost, every garrison, was already burning. The decision made at dawn on the second day told everything about how rapidly the situation had deteriorated. The Romans burned their surplus baggage. Cassius Dio records it plainly in his account. They abandoned or destroyed __quote _16 __. The merchant goods, the personal possessions, the administrative records of a functioning province, the domestic equipment of the camp followers. All of it was committed to fire in the gray early morning. This was not a logistical adjustment. It was a tactical admission. A Roman army that burns its own baggage is an army that has accepted it is in a fighting withdrawal, not a march. The archaeological record at Calcries speaks directly to this moment. Among the 6,000-plus Roman military objects recovered from the site over decades of excavation, museum director Stefan Burmeister has noted the remarkable mixture of artifact types. Elite legionary armor found alongside domestic cooking equipment, surgical instruments alongside weapons, gold coins alongside the everyday tools of camp life, jewelry, hairpins, and a disc brooch indicating the presence of women. The __quote _17 as archaeologists have described it, is the physical fingerprint of the moment. Note the baggage train and the fighting line lost their separation. When civilians and soldiers were no longer in distinct positions, but intermixed in a column that had ceased to have a rear. The weather had worsened. Rain that had begun as an operational nuisance was becoming a tactical factor, waterlogging the ground, the shields, the bowstrings, the carefully maintained equipment of an army that had been designed to fight in Mediterranean conditions. The forest pressed close, limiting visibility and preventing the deployment of the formations that Roman tactical doctrine required. Every advantage the legions carried, their standardized weapons, their formation discipline, their engineering capability, required space and stability to function. The terrain was consuming both. Then came the development that Cassius Dio records with particular weight. Quote 18. The tribal confederation was growing. The warriors who had held back during the first day, watching from the tree line, evaluating, waiting to see whether the Romans were genuinely trapped or merely inconvenienced, had seen enough. The most powerful military force in the known world was bleeding and retreating in a forest, unable to deploy effectively, with no relief coming and no open ground ahead. The calculation that had made neutrality seem prudent the day before had reversed entirely. Every new warrior who appeared from the trees added to the psychological weight on the Roman column. The enemy was not a fixed quantity that could be depleted and defeated. it was actively increasing. The army that had left camp was already smaller than the one that had departed the Weser. The army facing them was already larger than the one that had struck on day 1, and ahead of them waited the Narrows, where Arminius, who knew exactly what they would find, was already in position. Then they saw it. The earthen rampart emerged from the tree line on the southern side of the corridor as the Roman column pushed deeper into the Kalkries Narrows. It ran along the hillside for a distance that archaeological measurement has confirmed at a minimum of 700 meters, though the actual extent may have been considerably longer as excavations continue. 1.5 meters high, a wooden palisade reinforcing the top, gates at intervals designed not as entry points but as sally ports, openings through which Germanic warriors could burst forward in concentrated attacks, strike the compressed column below, and withdraw behind the wall before Roman discipline could organize a response. It had been waiting all summer. The Romans attempted to assault it. The archaeological evidence at Kalkries is unambiguous on this point. The concentration of Roman military artifacts, swords, daggers, javelin heads, sling bullets, helmet fragments, armor pieces, piles up in front of the wall's position and falls sharply to near nothing behind it. This distribution pattern is the battlefield itself speaking. Men attacked that wall from the front and did not cross it. The debris of their effort is still there, measured and mapped by modern excavation, a 2,000-year-old forensic record of a tactical failure. Cassius Dio's account provides the physical explanation. ___, quote _ 19 ___. The rain that had been falling since the march began had now produced conditions that systematically dismantled Roman tactical capability. The scuda, those large laminated shields that were the legionaries' primary protection, had absorbed water until they were dangerously heavy. Standard estimates for a dry Roman scudum run to approximately 10 kilograms. Waterlogged, the weight would have increased substantially. Men holding shields too heavy to raise effectively, in formation too compressed for coordinated movement, attacking an elevated wall held by fighters who could withdraw at will, in rain that negated Roman missile weapons while barely affecting the Germanic spears and axes. The tactical geometry was a catastrophe. What emerged from behind those gates were not undisciplined raiders, but warriors using terrain and fortification with evident operational purpose. The gates allowed controlled engagement, sally, strike, withdraw, that denied the Romans the sustained close quarters fighting in which their training and equipment were superior. Every Roman advance toward the wall was met with concentrated resistance at the gate positions. Every attempt to concentrate force for a breach was disrupted by attacks from the flanks, where the forest provided constant cover. Somewhere in the debris of this assault lies the object that now sits behind glass in the Kalkries Museum, a silver-coated iron face mask, originally part of a Roman cavalry parade helmet. It was designed for ceremonial display, the kind of elaborate equipment a cavalryman wore at public reviews and military exercises to demonstrate the imperial army's magnificence. It was found on the ground north of the wall position, in the zone where Roman soldiers died. Its owner almost certainly used it to polish brass and impress crowds, not to fight in a forest corridor in the rain. Its presence on this battlefield is the most eloquent single object from the entire disaster. The professional magnificence of the imperial army face down in German mud. The Romans had built roads across Europe. They had bridged the Rhine. They had constructed aqueducts that still carry water 2,000 years later. Against a 1.5-meter mud wall built by men they considered barbarians, the finest army on earth could not advance a single step. The fourth day came with what Cassius Dio records as a continuation of the storms. a underscore quote underscore 20 underscore that had accompanied the entire march from its first hours and now assailed men who had been fighting, marching, and dying in rain for 4 consecutive days. All 4 of the ancient primary sources who described the battle, Velleius Paterculus, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, and Florus, converge on what happened next with a unanimity that historians consider exceptional for ancient accounts of military events. There is no dispute. There is no conflicting tradition. Every source that discusses the end of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest agrees that Publius Varys, governor of Germania and commander of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions of the Roman Empire, fell upon his own sword. He was approximately 55 years old. The decision to commit suicide rather than be captured was not cowardice by Roman understanding. It was the last available act of Roman dignity. Capture at the hands of the Germanic tribes meant ritual execution, torture, sacrifice to their gods. Roman officers knew this. The accounts of what happened to captured soldiers, which would emerge in the years following as survivors told their stories and Roman armies eventually recovered the battlefield, made the alternative to suicide clear. Varus chose the manner of his own death rather than surrender it to his captors. The officers around him made the same choice. The sources record that many of his senior commanders followed him in suicide, falling on their swords in the collapsing remnant of what had been the most professional military organization in the ancient world. One officer made a different choice. Velleius Paterculus, who knew the man and recorded his judgment with unconcealed contempt, documents that Valla Numonius, lieutenant of Varus and the army's senior cavalry officer, set a fearful example in that he left the infantry. He attempted to ride for the Rhine with the cavalry, abandoning the foot soldiers to their fate. Paterculus does not soften this assessment. It was desertion, documented by name in the first serious historical account of the disaster to be written. Numonius did not reach safety. He died in the attempt. The Germanic forces found Varus's body. It had been partially burned. The Romans had attempted to deny their enemies the trophy of the governor's remains, a military courtesy to the dead that the living had just enough organization left to perform. The burning did not prevent what came next. Velleius Paterculus records that the enemy mangled the half-burned body of Varus. His head was severed. Arminius sent it east to Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, as both a diplomatic gesture and an offer of military alliance against Rome. It was the most powerful possible calling card. The physical remains of Rome's authority in Germania, packaged as a gift. Maroboduus declined the alliance. He sent Varus's head to Rome. Augustus, who had sent Varus to Germania, who had endorsed the appointment, who bore a share of institutional responsibility for the disaster, had the head interred in the imperial family mausoleum. Despite whatever private fury he directed at the man who had lost 20,000 soldiers, he buried him with the dignity of family. The commander was dead. His head was traveling east across the Germanic world. And somewhere in the forest, 15,000 men were still trying to find a way out. What remained of the 3 legions after Varus's death was no longer an army in any functional sense. It was a mass of surviving soldiers without centralized command. In hostile terrain they could not navigate. Surrounded by an enemy force whose numbers had grown throughout the engagement, with no relief coming and no route to safety, they could reliably identify. Velleius Paterculus, whose account reflects the testimony of survivors he could speak with directly, records the outcome without softening. Quote 23 a handful escaped. The sources confirm this, specifically because those survivors carried the news to Rome. The first knowledge Augustus received of the disaster came from men who had made it back across the Rhine, men whose testimony would inform every historical account that followed. Their escape was exceptional rather than representative. For most of the 20,000, the outcomes were documented in the years that followed. Killed in the final collapse, captured and enslaved, or sacrificed to Germanic gods. Tacitus records that captured Roman officers were executed on the altars that Roman soldiers would find still standing in the forest when they returned 6 years later. The historian Florus, writing approximately 150 years after the events, and considered by scholars the least reliable of the 4 primary sources, describes scenes of particular brutality. Eyes removed, hands cut off, with the rhetorical intensity characteristic of his style. These details should be understood as belonging to Florus specifically, whose account is marked by dramatic amplification rather than as corroborated historical fact shared across all the sources. One act of resistance within the collapse deserves specific record. A Roman fort in the region, most historians identify it as Aliso, likely located at modern Haltern am See, held out under siege for an extended period after the main army's destruction. Velleius Paterculus specifically names and praises its commander, Lucius Caedicius, prefect of the camp, who maintained a resolute defense against what Paterculus describes as an immense force of Germans. When the siege became untenable, Caedicius organized a breakout, leading the garrison through the surrounding Germanic forces to the Rhine. Paterculus, who might have been expected to focus entirely on the disaster, takes time to record this act of command by name, an implicit acknowledgement that within the catastrophe, individual Roman discipline and leadership produced at least one documented success. Varus's nephew, Lucius Nonius Asprenas, commanding 2 legions that had remained west of the Rhine, held the Rhine line and prevented Arminius from extending the disaster into Gaul. The spoken past analysis of the immediate aftermath, drawing on Velleius Paterculus, records that Asprenus's decisive action in holding the Rhine was crucial. Without it, the revolt could have spread into the settled Roman West. The most haunting detail from the immediate aftermath belongs not to the days after the battle, but to the decades. Tacitus, in his Annals, records that around the year 50 of the Common Era, approximately 40 years after the disaster, a Roman force under Publius Pomponius Secundus defeated a Chatti raiding party in Germania Superior and liberated Roman prisoners found among their captives. Some of these men had been held in Germanic territory since Varus's army was destroyed. 40 years. They had been prisoners since the year 9. When Roman soldiers found them, the empire that had sent them into the forest was on its 4th emperor. The battle was over in 4 days. Its consequences would take 4 decades to fully unfold. And for some of its survivors, it never ended at all. The news reached Rome in stages, each confirmation worse than the last, carried by the handful of survivors who had made it back across the Rhine. What those men reported was not the partial defeat of a Roman force in a frontier engagement, the kind of military setback that empires absorb and address. What they reported was the complete annihilation of 3 full legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, along with their auxiliary units, their cavalry, their camp followers, and their commanding general. Roughly 20,000 people. Gone. Those 3 legions represented approximately 10% of Rome's entire frontline military strength. Cassius Dio and other sources make clear that Augustus immediately grasped the strategic dimensions of the loss. He sent patrols into Rome's streets to prevent urban unrest in the event of a Gallic or Germanic invasion he feared might follow. He conscripted freedmen, formerly enslaved individuals, into the military to replace the manpower lost. This was a measure so extreme that Romans associated it specifically with the darkest moments of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal had driven so deep into Italy that the Republic had been forced to arm slaves. Augustus's Rome was not a republic at its existential limit. It was the dominant power of the known world. And it was arming freedmen because it had just lost a tenth of its army in a German forest. Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars approximately a century after the events, records Augustus's personal response in a passage that has become the most famous single reaction to military defeat in the ancient record. The emperor, Suetonius writes, was so shaken by the disaster quote, 26, The Latin original is preserved. Quintili var, legions ready. Augustus was 72 years old. He had been building and managing the empire for 40 years. He had ended civil wars, survived conspiracies, established institutions that would endure for centuries. He had not encountered anything like this. The 3 destroyed legion numbers, 17, 18, and 19, were permanently retired from the Roman military order of battle. This was not standard practice. Legions that had been defeated before had eventually seen their numbers reused, their disgrace treated as temporary. The 3 legions of Varys were treated differently. Their numbers were considered cursed, carrying with them the stain of the most complete military disaster in a generation. No Roman legion ever again carried the designations 17, 18, or 19. 2,000 years later, those numbers remain absent from the historical record of Roman military organization, a permanent gap that marks the shape of what was lost. Despite the fury that Augustus felt toward the man who had commanded this disaster, and Suetonius records him sometimes quote, 27, Varys's name in moments of distress. He had Varys's head, returned from Maroboduus, interred with full dignity in the imperial family mausoleum. The scapegoating of Varys as personally responsible would come later, under Tiberius, when Velleius Paterculus would condemn him to, quote, 28. Under Augustus himself, the reckoning was more complex. He had sent Varys. Tiberius had declared the province pacified. The institutional failure was shared, even if the name attached to it was singular. Augustus had spent 40 years building the most powerful military machine in human history. In 4 September days, he discovered what it could not do. 6 years later, a Roman army came back. In the year 15 of the Common Era, the general Germanicus, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, adopted son of Augustus, the most celebrated Roman commander of his generation, led a campaign into Germanic territory as part of Rome's sustained effort to avenge the disaster and recover what had been lost. He sent one of his subordinate commanders, Lucius Stertinius, ahead with a mobile column into Bructeri territory. While the Bructeri were burning their own possessions ahead of the Roman advance, Stertinius's soldiers found something in the destruction. Tacitus records it in his annals. The eagle standard of the 19th Legion, lost with Varys 6 years before. It was the first of the 3 sacred standards to come home. Then Germanicus marched to the battlefield itself. Tacitus's account of what his army found, written drawing on Pliny the Elder's history of the Germanic Wars, which itself drew on the testimony of survivors who had been debriefed by Roman commanders, is one of the most devastating passages in ancient historiography. The army moved through what Tacitus describes as, quote, 29. They found Varys's first camp, its wide perimeter and measured interior still readable in the landscape after 6 years, a geometric ghost of what 3 legions' organized labor had built. they found the half-ruined secondary camp, its shallower ditch and collapsed rampart showing where a shrinking, desperate remnant had tried to establish a final defensible position. Then they found the field. In the center of the killing ground, Tacitus records, were ___quote _30 ___. The scattered bones marked where men had run. The heaped bones marked where men had stood and fought and died in place. After 6 years of exposure, the bones had been picked clean. Splintered weapons lay around them, fragments of horse limbs. And then, Tacitus states this without elaboration, as a documented fact observed by the army in front of him, quote, 31, in the nearby groves. Altars. The altars where, according to those who had survived the disaster and now walked among its remains with Germanicus's army, the Roman officers and senior centurions had been sacrificed. Survivors were present. This is crucial to understanding the evidential weight of Tacitus's account. Men who had escaped the disaster in the year 9, and men who had later been captured and subsequently freed, were walking the battlefield with the army, pointing out specific locations. Here the legates fell. There the eagles were taken. Here was where Varys received his first wound. There was where he died. They pointed to the raised platform from which Arminius had addressed his warriors after the battle. They showed the gibbets where prisoners had been hanged. The altars were not a literary device. They were physical structures still standing, still identifiable, pointed out by men who had watched what happened on them. Germanicus himself laid the first turf of the burial mound for the dead. A personal act of mourning that Tacitus records with evident approval. The army buried what it could find, without being able to identify most of the remains. Tacitus writes that the soldiers buried every bone they encountered, quote, 32, quote. They did not know which bones belonged to their relatives. They could not distinguish a cousin from a stranger among the whitened fragments of 6 years' exposure. So they buried everything as family. Tiberius, the emperor, subsequently forbade the burial, either from jealousy of the glory Germanicus was acquiring, as Tacitus suggests with his characteristic suspicion of the emperor, or because Tiberius genuinely believed that the sight of mass unburied dead would demoralize future Roman soldiers operating in the same territory. The prohibition came too late, for the mound Germanicus had already started. It could not undo what the army had seen. Germanicus buried what he could find. He could not give the dead their names back. He could not restore Rome's certainty that Germania could be governed. What he could give them, what the bones demanded, was that someone had come back. To understand why 3 gilded military standards consumed decades of Roman strategic attention, occupied the campaigns of 3 emperors, and their eventual recovery was celebrated with a triumph in Rome, it is necessary to understand what a legionary eagle was not. It was not a trophy. It was not a regimental flag in the modern sense. The aquila, the golden or silver-gilded eagle mounted on a staff, carried at the front of each legion, was understood in Roman religious and military culture as the physical embodiment of the legion's soul, its divine protection, its identity as a coherent fighting entity. Each legion was responsible for its eagle with the totality of its existence. A legion that lost its eagle had, in Roman understanding, lost something metaphysical as well as material. 3 eagles had fallen into Germanic hands in September of the year 9. 3 pieces of Roman honor were sitting as sacred trophies in Germanic tribal territories, displayed as evidence that Rome's gods had abandoned their legions in the forest. The recovery of the 19th Legion's eagle came in the year 15, in circumstances that are almost cinematically appropriate. Germanicus's subordinate, Lucius Stertinius, leading a punitive sweep through Bructeri territory, found the eagle while the Bructeri were burning their own possessions ahead of the Roman advance. It was recovered from the destruction of the very tribe that had been present at its capture. Tacitus records this in his annals with the restrained precision of a writer who understood exactly what the moment meant. The second eagle, belonging to either the 17th or the 18th legion, with sources varying on the specific attribution, was recovered the following year, in the year 16, from the Marsi during Germanicus's extended campaigns. These recoveries were celebrated in Rome, and Germanicus was granted a triumph in the year 17, partly in recognition of them. 2 eagles home. The legions had not been reconstituted, but their honor had been partially reclaimed. The third eagle waited longer, significantly longer. It remained in the possession of the Chauci, a tribe on the shores of the North Sea, for a total of 32 years. The final Aquila was not recovered until the year 41 of the Common Era, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, Augustus's great-nephew, a man who had been a child when the disaster occurred, by a general named Publius Gabinius. Cassius Dio notes this recovery, though with a caveat that scholars at livius.org have flagged. The relevant manuscript evidence is fragmentary, with the specific tribal attribution preserved in only one manuscript, now lost but known to Renaissance scholarship. The recovery itself is accepted as historical. The eagle had spent 32 years as a Germanic sacred object, acquired in battle against Rome's greatest force and held through 3 subsequent emperors' reigns. Where the recovered eagles were eventually placed, most historians believe, though direct documentation is limited on this specific point, was the temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, in the Forum of Augustus. It would have been the appropriate destination. Augustus had vowed the temple during the civil wars. The recovered symbols of the empire's most humiliating defeat would have found their logical home in the shrine of the god of military vengeance. Tacitus, in his annals, preserves one more detail from this period that the outline of military history tends to obscure. During Germanicus's campaigns in the years 15 and 16, there occurred a scene on the banks of the Weser River that has the quality of a story almost too dramatic to be real, except that Tacitus recorded it, and it belongs to primary source history. Arminius and his brother Flavius were encamped on opposite sides of the river, in opposite armies. They shouted at each other across the water. Tacitus records fragments of the exchange. Flavius speaking of Roman rewards and honors, Arminius of Germanic freedom and ancestral custom. The same childhood, the same Roman education, the same knowledge of both worlds, and the Weser River running between them, each man unable to cross to the other, each representing the road the other had not taken. The argument ended without resolution, as the river itself required. It is the human center of the entire story. Rome got its eagles back. What it never recovered was its certainty that Germania could be conquered. By the year 16 of the Common Era, Germanicus had achieved results that Tacitus, writing with undisguised admiration for the general and unconcealed suspicion of his emperor, described as verging on the decisive. He had defeated Arminius at 2 set-piece battles, the Battle of Idistaviso and the Battle of the Angravarian Wall. He had recovered 2 of the 3 eagles. He had penetrated deep into Germanic territory and demonstrated that Roman armies could operate there, inflicting substantial losses on the coalition that had destroyed Varus's legions 7 years before. By Tacitus's assessment, one more campaign season might have finished the war. Tiberius recalled him anyway. The emperor's decision, which Tacitus attributes partly to jealousy of Germanicus's popularity and partly to genuine strategic calculation, has been evaluated by modern historians primarily in terms of its strategic logic, and that logic is difficult to dispute. The Rhine was a better defensive line than the Elbe. Permanent occupation of the vast forested territories between the two rivers would require a military commitment that the empire could not sustain indefinitely, against a population that had already demonstrated its willingness to absorb enormous losses in pursuit of independence. The economic return on such an occupation. Livius.org scholar Jonah Lendering notes that Germania's agrarian economy offered relatively little that Rome couldn't obtain more cheaply through trade and diplomacy, did not justify the cost. Tiberius was making a calculation that Augustus, blinded by the vision of a Rhine to Elbe province, had been unable to make. That not every territory worth defeating was worth holding. The Rhine became the permanent western frontier of the Roman Empire. Over the following century, the military infrastructure built to maintain and defend that line was transformed into something that outlasted the empire itself. The garrison towns became cities. Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium became Cologne. Moguntiacum became Mainz. Argentoratum became Strasbourg. Augusta Vindelicorum became Augsburg. These were not planned as cities. They were planned as military bases, the administrative and logistical nodes of a frontier system whose existence was a consequence of a decision made in a German forest in September of the year 9. They became cities because people settled around military infrastructure, because trade follows security, because the rhythm of human settlement follows the rhythms of power. The frontier Rome built to contain what Arminius had protected is now the urban backbone of Central Europe. Arminius himself did not live to see any of this. Tacitus, who wrote of him in terms that no Roman historian used easily of any enemy, quote, 33 Librator haud dubiae Germaniae, records his death in the year 21 of the Common Era. He was killed by members of his own tribe, probably family members who feared his growing ambition for a Germanic kingship that the tribes were unwilling to grant him. The man who had refused to be ruled by Rome was killed by the people he had liberated before they would accept his rule. Tacitus notes the irony without elaboration. He had been approximately 37 years old. Peter Wells, the archaeologist and author of The Battle That Stopped Rome, published in 2003, offers what many historians consider the most precise encapsulation of the battle's long-term consequence. It led to the creation of a militarized frontier in the middle of Europe that endured for 400 years. And it created a boundary between Germanic and Latin cultures that lasted 2,000 years. The territory west of the Rhine underwent centuries of Romanization. Its inhabitants eventually speaking languages descended from Latin, organizing their societies on Roman models, building cities on Roman foundations. The territory east of the Rhine did not. The linguistic and cultural divide that runs through modern Europe between the Latin-derived languages of France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Romania on one side, and the Germanic languages of Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and eventually England on the other, traces its origins to this line, to this river, to 4 days in September. Arminius had stopped Rome at the Rhine. In doing so, he had drawn a line across Europe that would define its languages, its cultures, its wars, and its nations for the next 2,000 years. Here is a consequence that the standard military history of Teutoburg rarely pauses to examine, but that scholar Jonah Lendering of the classical history resource Livius.org has articulated with particular force. If Rome had held and Romanized the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe, the North Sea tribes later known as Angles and Saxons, would have been absorbed into the Latin-speaking Roman world. Their language, the Germanic tongue that would eventually become the basis of English, would either have been replaced by Latin or survived as a marginal regional dialect. The language you are currently hearing in every word of this script would not exist. Or, to be precise about the scholarly argument, Lendering writes that the North Sea tribes that were later known as Saxons would have spoken Latin. The English language would, for better or worse, never have existed, and German would have been marginal. This is presented as a scholarly argument, not a certainty. History's counterfactuals always carry uncertainty. But the underlying mechanism is clear and documented. The contrast with Gaul makes it concrete. West of the Rhine, Roman conquest led to a process of Romanization so thorough that the local Celtic languages disappeared and were replaced by Latin, the ancestor of modern French. The same process, applied to the same degree, east of the Rhine would have had the same effect on Germanic languages. It was not applied because Arminius stopped it. The linguistic divide Wells describes as lasting 2,000 years is the most immediately personal way to understand the civilizational scale of Teutoburg's consequences. Every sentence spoken or written in English, German, Dutch, or any other Germanic language represents a linguistic tradition that survived because a 25-year-old Cheruscan nobleman studied Roman military doctrine, identified the terrain where it would fail, built a wall in a forest over one summer, and guided 20,000 soldiers to their deaths in 4 days of September rain. The archaeological record continues to amplify the story. The museum and park Kalkries, built into the landscape above the battlefield in a structure designed to be architecturally invisible, to disappear into the ground that it commemorates, is still an active excavation site. Over 25,000 artifacts have been recovered from the fields and peat edges of the Kalkries area, and new discoveries continue. In the year 2016, archaeologists working at the site found 8 gold aurae, Roman gold coins, clustered together in a small area, along with a hoard of over 200 silver denarii. These coins were almost certainly hidden by someone who expected to return for them. The person who hid them did not come back. The coins lay in the ground for 2,007 years. In 2024, a new geoarchaeological study raised questions about the precise dating of some structural elements at the site, including a V-shaped ditch and portions of the rampart system, suggesting that some features may have been modified or disturbed by medieval agricultural activity. The study is careful to note that it does not dispute the identification of Kalkries as the site of a major Roman-Germanic conflict. The overwhelming density of Roman military artifacts, the Augustan-era coins, the marked legionary equipment, the human remains bearing combat trauma, none of this is in question. The earth at Kalkries is still speaking. Historians are still listening. What military analysts and historians have found when they study Teutoburg through a modern operational lens is a template that recurs across 2,000 years of subsequent conflict. The use of terrain, deception, and asymmetric tactics by a smaller, locally knowledgeable force against a larger, technologically superior opponent that has been deceived about the nature of its environment. The tactics that destroyed Varys's legions, channeling a superior force into terrain that negated its advantages, using pre-constructed positions to compensate for open field weakness, coordinating simultaneous strikes across a wide area to prevent mutual reinforcement, sustaining the engagement long enough for psychological pressure to compound tactical losses. These are not ancient curiosities. They are recognized in modern military analysis as foundational principles of irregular warfare, studied with the same attention that military historians give to Cannae and Marathon. Velleius Paterculus, writing within a generation of the battle and drawing on his own service in the region, offered a verdict that 20 centuries of subsequent analysis have not substantially improved. Rome's army was exterminated almost to a man by the very enemy whom it had always slaughtered like cattle. The precision of that sentence is what gives it its enduring force, not by a superior force, not by a technological innovation, by the enemy it had always slaughtered like cattle. The same people, the same weapons, the same terrain, with one variable changed: the knowledge carried in the mind of one man of exactly where the machine would break. The Hermannsdenkmal, the monument to Arminius, or Hermann, as the German nationalist tradition renamed him, stands on a hill near Detmold in the Teutoburg Forest and was completed in the year 1875. The same year the newly unified German Empire was consolidated under Kaiser Wilhelm I. It is the tallest statue in Germany, a copper figure of Arminius in Roman armor, sword raised toward France, the direction of Germany's recent enemy. Standing on a sandstone pedestal inscribed with the words, quote, 37, quote. The monument has almost nothing to do with the historical Arminius. It has everything to do with what 19th century German nationalism needed from an ancient story. This is the second life of Teutoburg, and it is worth understanding because it shapes how the battle has been remembered and misremembered for the past 2 centuries. The humanist scholar Conrad Keltis identified Arminius as a German national ancestor in the Renaissance, when the rediscovery of Tacitus's works provided a usable heroic narrative for a region seeking cultural identity. The identification deepened through the Reformation and intensified dramatically in the 19th century, when the newly unified German state needed founding myths with sufficient antiquity to compete with the classical traditions of France and Britain. Arminius became Hermann. The battle became a national founding moment. The monument was built. The actual Arminius, the 25-year-old Roman citizen and auxiliary commander who chose Germanic freedom over Roman preferment, who was subsequently murdered by his own tribe before he could achieve the Germanic kingship he sought, and who was described by a Roman historian as Germany's liberator in a passage written with genuine admiration and genuine ambivalence, had no interest in German nationalism. The concept would not exist for another 18 centuries. He was fighting for the Cherusci, not for Germany. He was fighting, in the most specific possible sense, for the right of his people to live according to their own customs rather than Rome's. That specific, local, personal purpose has been obscured by the monument and the myth. The history is more interesting than the symbol. The ongoing excavations at Kalkries are a counter-monument of their own kind, not fixed, not symbolic, not finished. The site continues to yield evidence that complicates and enriches the story. The 2024 geoarchaeological study is the most recent example. Scholars actively revisiting their own previous interpretations, refining the analysis of structural elements, acknowledging what remains uncertain after more than 3 decades of excavation. This is what historical knowledge actually looks like, as distinct from historical myth. Not a settled story, but a progressive accumulation of evidence that continuously updates its own conclusions. The battle is not over in the sense that its historical understanding is complete. It is over in the sense that the men are dead. Everything else is still being worked out. What the forest knows, what the excavated artifacts and the bone trauma and the hidden coin hoards and the silver face mask collectively testify to, is something simpler than any of the myths that have been built around it. 20,000 people walked into a corridor they had been guided to by someone they trusted. They could not deploy their training. They could not use their equipment effectively. They could not receive reinforcements or establish communication with their rear. They died because the ground they were on had been chosen for them, prepared for months before they arrived, by a man who understood the mechanism of their destruction better than they understood it themselves. That is the historical record. Everything that grew from it, the linguistic boundary, the failed province, the permanent frontier, the emperor knocking his head against the wall in grief, grew from 4 days in a German forest when the ground itself became the decisive weapon. In the Kalkries Museum today, behind glass in a building designed to disappear into the landscape above the battlefield, the silver face mask stares at nothing. Its owner died here. What he died for, the empire's certainty that it could not be beaten, died here too. The numbers have not changed in 2,000 years. Roughly 20,000 Roman soldiers entered the forest. Roughly a handful came out. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, approximately 10% of Rome's entire frontline military strength, as documented by Cassius Dio, ceased to exist as fighting units in 4 days. Their numbers were never used again. A century and a half after the battle, Roman children were still being educated with the story as a warning. The anniversary was observed as a day of national mourning for as long as Augustus lived. The strategic consequences shaped the continent. The Rhine frontier that Tiberius fixed and the empire maintained for 400 years drew the boundary between the Latin-speaking west and the Germanic-speaking north and east. The boundary, as Peter Wells has argued, whose linguistic consequences lasted 2,000 years and whose cultural effects are visible in the map of modern Europe's languages today. The cities of the Rhine frontier, built as military installations to hold the line that Arminius had forced, are cities that people live in now. Cologne, Mainz, Strasbourg, Augsburg. Urban lives built on the foundation of a decision made in September of the year 9. Arminius was 37 years old when his own people killed him. He had freed Germania from Rome at 25. He died before he could turn that freedom into a kingdom, which was probably what the Cherusci had in mind. Tacitus recorded his death with the equanimity of a writer who understood that the most important things about historical figures are often the ironies that attach to them rather than the achievements. The man who refused Roman rule was refused Germanic rule. The liberator could not be king. The monument completed 18 centuries later, on the hill near Detmold with the sword pointed at France, would have been incomprehensible to him. What survives, beyond the monument and the myth, is what the ground at Kalkries holds. The surgical instruments that belonged to a doctor who was trying to keep people alive when the killing started. The cooking pots of camp followers who had followed the army east, because armies carry economic life with them, and someone has to feed the soldiers. The hairpins of women whose names were never recorded. The gold coins someone hid under the earth and never came back for. The face of a man who polished his parade mask and could not have imagined that it would still be looked at 2,000 years after he died. History does not belong only to the commanders and the emperors who break against walls in grief. It belongs also to the doctor with the surgical kit, and the woman with the hairpin, and the soldier who hid the gold coins and believed, in the last moment when belief was still possible, that he would be back to collect them. They are all at Kalkries. The ground still holds them, and the excavations continue.